سلام سلام እንኳዕ ደሓን መፅኹም ኣነ ኣሉላ ውነይ ትበሃል እየ ንሕና ኣብ ኣክሱማን ሚድያ ኔትወርክ እንግሊዝኛ ሓድሽ ፕሮግራም መፂና እና ካብ ሕጂ እንግሊዝኛ ትቅፅል እየ ግን ምስ ካልእ ሰብ ተቐሊድኩም እንግሊዝኛ ትፈልጥ ወይ ትግርኛ ኣይዛርብን እዮም እዚ ሼር ጌርኩም ፖስት ጌርኩም ፅቡቅ ነይሩ እና ኣቶ ኪዳነ ከመቀናሃ how are you? We can continue in English. As I said, it's good to be with you. Thank you for your time. So, how's everything?
Sure, Alula. Thank you. It looks like you're mastering Tigrinya. Yeah, by the way, for your information, I was not born and raised in Tigray myself. I was born and raised in a town called Nazareth in central Ethiopia. ግን ትግርኛ ብፃዕሪ የተማሂረዮ ማለት እዩ ሶ ንስኻ እውን ተመሳሳሊ ኢኻ ትገብር ዘለኻ ስለዚ ፅቡቅ እዩ እፅላሉ
thank you okay Ato Kidane, we can talk about your book you have on the history of where we're from. We may not have been born there, but our families, generations are from there. We have a long history in Tigray, which I'm sure I don't have to explain to you. But your book, Habesha Chronicles, touches on a lot of the historical figures in our time that influenced where we are today in terms of Habesha as a whole and specifically Tigray. I believe it's available on Amazon, correct? Is there anywhere else they can get it?
So the electronic version is available on Kindle, Amazon. But if people want a printed version, there's a website called the Book Patch. They can get in there, search it, and order it.
Okay. And I think it's very important for us to support, our fellow Tagaru when they come out with something like this, like a book or anything really, but especially during time like we have now. So I would definitely say if you know any youth people who are looking to be just finding information on the history of Tigray, certainly give them the information, either as he said, where they can find it. Let them get a copy of this because the information is invaluable, and on top of that, we have to support our own, as I said. So before we really get into all of the topics that we have lined up in terms of all of the figures in your book, I wanted to talk about something I saw in the beginning. You say the Habesha Chronicles will take you in a time journey through the history of Habesha people in Ethiopia and Eritrea who have a long history of statehood, and statehood meaning basically, self-determination, independence, right? So if you could just elaborate a little bit on that and kind of like how it relates today, that'd be nice.
Sure. Tigrayans specifically and the Habesha people in general, we are blessed with a very long history of statehood. Not a lot of people in the world that have that kind of heritage. So we are that's a great wealth that we have, which we should maintain and build our current state on what we have in the past. As a matter of fact, the Habesha people do not only have a long history of statehood, but a long history of civilization. As a matter of fact, we contributed spoken language to humanity. We contributed most of the technology of humanity in the earliest days of humanity. As you know, humanity started in Africa and passed through Asia, through the east of Africa, and more specifically, through the Horn of Africa. So humanity reached to its current sophisticated format when it was around the area that we call northern Ethiopia, Tigray, Afar, and Eritrea. So humanity developed by the time before they crossed the Red Sea. Humanity has developed tools language, and started living as a society with communication skills and things like that. So it can be said that we are the children of those ancestors who created those communication tools, and more specifically, alphabets and numbers. As you know, the numbers that we use in the West at this time, they are called Arabic numbers. In fact, they are not Arabic. They are
Yeah.
created by our ancestors. The Arabs learned them from our ancestors. We also were able to separate different types of metals from the earth before the rest of humanity was able to do that. So our ancestors can be said they were a lot more advanced than the rest of their companions at that time in the rest of the world. Uh, so we do not only have a long history of statehood, but we have a long history of civilization.
Wow. Thank you. Okay, so before we really get, I think you covered a lot right there. That was a great intro into your book and to our history as a whole, as Habesha and Tagaru, as you stated. Um, but before we really get into that, I want to talk a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind. So, in your book, in the beginning, it gives you a little bit background on yourself, and you are chairman of the board Ethiopian, or I guess Tagaru um, community of Minnesota, correct?
That's correct. So I served as in the board of Tigray community in Minnesota for 4 years, two of them as the chairman of the board. Um, yes, that's correct.
Okay, could you? I The reason I bring it up is could you elaborate a little bit on the importance of this kind of group to the community, and specifically to the youth of Tigray, obviously all over the world, not just Minnesota. Um, just the importance in terms of the group for themselves, but as a whole.
Definitely. Societies are very important. I will give you some numbers, some statistics here. I think more than a quarter of Harvard University students are Jews. And from what I looked at some point, 48% of Yale University students were Jews. And this makes you ask this question. But at the same time, only about 1% of the overall US population are Jews. So there is a great skewness there. So where does that come from? You have to ask, right? So
Yeah.
one of the strengths of the Jews is that they are well organized when it comes to community. They have more than 350 community centers across the US. This is counting only the community centers in the US. They have other associations and things like that. So it's through these community centers they help one another, they collaborate, communicate, and coordinate. So that helps the new generation that's growing up first to have their understanding their identity, to be proud of who they are, and also leverage the platform so that they can collaborate, network, and coordinate between one another and learn from one another. So there's another interesting fact: the Israel is only uh, maybe a little bit more than half a century old at this time. So the Jews built Israel from nothing to where it is today. One of the top technology, actually next to the U.S., Israel is the top innovator of technology at this time. So they built it to that level because they were able to work as communities wherever they are, whether in the U.S. or in Europe or wherever they are. They have strong communities that help them raise the new generation with a good sense of identity and with network. So communities are very important for people. One, to know their roots and to know their identity, and two, to network and collaborate between one another and to leverage that to have a successful life in the future.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you. I next, right before we get into our first person, I wanted to talk about another thing that you touched on before you got into the book that really struck a chord, and it kind of relates to what you spoke on just now. But you stated your mother taught you the love of humanity, country, community, and family. And I wanted you to just touch, if you could, just a little bit on how this relates to Garo traditions, culture, and morals as a whole. And I think the reason I bring it up is I think it's very important during a time like now that we're dealing
Yeah, so I was raised by a single mother, and my mother, I I uh, I give it all to my mother to who I am today. She taught me, as I said, the love of humanity, community, family, and country. I have a very strong sense of identity when it comes to being Tigray, and I got that from my mother. And also, my mother always taught me to learn who I am. I remember every time before we had dinner or after we have dinner, she asked me to read her the story of the Queen of Sheba, the story of Saint Yared, and things like that. And she asked me to read the Bible and things like that. So, uh, as Tigrayans, most of us, we have a very strong family traditions, and uh, that makes us strong people in general. Wherever we are, Tigrayans have a good drive, resolve for success. And I think we get that from our family, from the tradition. Our ancestors were strong people, still we keep that in our DNA, in our social fabrics. So I think we have to continue that. We have to even push that further so that we build strong communities. Uh, and by doing that, as I mentioned earlier, we can build a better future for our children, and also we will build hopefully a great nation.
Wow, thank you, thank you. That was a great point. Just it sounds like an amazing moment. Um, First, I guess we could start the history of Tigray. Like we said, it's so vast, and rich, and so many people we could really talk about. But Yared of Aksum, I thought, was a very good person to start with in terms of the importance of his um, just all of that he did in his life, and in terms of with mezmur and music as a whole, and lots of stories in terms of how he lived his life. And if he perhaps was not, African or Tagalog, he may have been highlighted a lot more in history as a whole, in terms of the whole world. But if you could just give a little bit of information on him to the youth and his importance, as I stated, that would be great.
I think you make a good point. If Yared was from Europe or somewhere, I'm sure he would have been a great personality in the world. I think he's a lot more than Beethoven or Mozart. Those guys made great music, but Yared made a lot more than just great music. He created the school system, and when I say school system, it includes a lot of faculties under it. So he was a great person. And the other thing about Yared is he is an embodiment of the Tigrayan story. Because one thing that's peculiar about Yared, the key lessons we take up from Yared's life is that he learned from his failures. He had a lot of challenge, and he came through his challenges. And as you know, Tigrayans in our history passed through a lot of challenge as a society, as a nation. So that makes me think about Yared. Um, Yared, he passed through challenges. He was not able to continue his school, and at some point, learning from a caterpillar. He observed
Yeah,
a caterpillar trying to climb on a tree trunk to eat from its leaves, and the caterpillar failed 6 times in climb up to the tree, in trying to climb up to the tree. and he tried 7 times, and he succeeded in the seventh time. And Yared reasoned after that, said, if I am a human being and believe that a human being is a better creature than a caterpillar, I should be able to, uh, uh, pass my challenges and achieve what I want to achieve. So, Tigrans, we are being tested with a lot of challenges. Um, so, as Yared, I think it's about time we make a decision, pass through our challenge, and start our better future, working on our better future. As much as there was a lot of potential in Yared, which later translated into great music, great knowledge, and great philosophy, I think there's a lot of wisdom, knowledge, and wealth in our society that's hidden. Once we get determined and start that journey, I think that will start coming out. So I think we are at that seventh climb where we will begin our nation anew and start reaping the benefit of the potential that we have.
Yes, I when I read your book, that's one thing. I was aware of the story previously because I read about Yard and his life story, but the caterpillar story really stood out to me as well, just in terms of, like you said, the Tagaru grit and determination in terms of getting up that seventh time to be able to try to become successful again. And I know it's a very like simple story in the fact that it's just a small creature getting up for that seventh time, like I said. But the what really stood out is just when you are going through something that we are like currently, it's very easy to be lost in despair, lose hope, and kind of think that you kind of get your surroundings become your reality, if you will. We are where we are, and you feel as though it's always going to be like that. But one thing we always say as Tagaro is, "Zay halif yalan," like there's nothing that will not shall not pass. Not only shall it not pass, there always can be better. So I thought that was a great point to bring up. Thank you. Um, Next, I was thinking we could cover on the arguably two of the greatest, most influential kings of Aksum, the Aksumine Empire, and the name of this network itself. Kings, Emperor Izana and Khalid. For me personally, I have a hard time. I guess it's a matter of opinion, discerning who's truly the most influential in terms of Habesha as a whole today, or even for the empire itself. But if you could give the youth a little bit of information, and anybody else who's looking, obviously, to get information on Khaled, or if you can, on both Izana and him in terms of their impact and just their history.
Sure. Actually, I can start from, I mentioned earlier that, humanity started in Africa and crossed to the rest of the world through the Horn of Africa, right?
Yeah.
After that, humanity got to its most sophisticated level in the area that we call Eritrea and Tigray today. Uh, and those people developed a lot of technology and wealth of knowledge. Um, so at some point, there were great kingdoms in the past, like the one that we call the Amat, which has a capital city a little bit further than Aksum called Yeha. Um, so Yeha is a city of the Amat, which was a great civilization at some point. The Da'amat civilization or the Da'amat kingdom uh, eventually got weakened, and the cities within the kingdom were divided amongst themselves. So one of the cities that were part of the Amat was Aksum. So eventually, the Aksum city got stronger, and typically empires are created starting from a city. Like for example, the Roman Empire came to be the Roman Empire starting from the city of Rome. So the same way goes for Aksum. The city of Aksum got stronger, and around 100 years before Christ, the city became really strong and started incorporating all the cities around it. So through that process, there were different types of organizations within that state, within that empire. So that empire included what's today Tigray, Eritrea, Afar, and on the east side of the Red Sea, what's called Yemen today, and majority of the southern Saudi Arabia. So all that was under the territory of that Aksumite empire. Um, so what happened was there were other great kings too, like Indubis, Aphilas, who had their own coins through which the world traded, the currencies. The Aksumite currencies were international currencies because, for example, Aphilas, King Aphilas's currency or coin was an international currency, and it was made from gold. He had a gold and silver coins, which were international currencies. And the Red Sea was at the center of international trade. So we starting from the 100 years before Christ until 300 years after Christ, the kingdom continued around 320 after Christ. That's when King Alameda of Aksum gave birth to twins, and they were named Izana and Saizana. So these two twins were raised by priests, actually two priests, who came from the Roman Empire. They were Christians. So that Christian was called Frementus, or we know him as Fremnatos in Tigrinya. So Frementus raised them as their babysitter or tutor, actually. He taught them Christianity and all the things. And when their father, Alameda, died, their mother, Sophia, became their guardian, and Izana became the king. And he was ordained as Abraha, King Abraha, and his brother was Atzbaha. So if you heard the name Abraha wa Atzbaha, which means Abraha and Atzbaha, those are Izana and Saizana. So Izana and Saizana ruled, and they declared that Christianity is the religion of the state. There were many Christians in Aksum and around Aksum, but the first emperor who declared Christianity as the religion of the state was Izana, or King Abraha. And he made Frementus the Pope, the Patriarch, and named him Abba Salama Kassat Ibrahim. So that's the time when the Empire of Aksum started using the name Ethiopia. Before that, it was not called Ethiopia. It's Izana who gave his empire the name Ethiopia with Christianity. And what happened was he ordered his brother Saizana, or Atzbaha, to go south and conquer the people in the south. And he told him, those who are willingly converting to Christians, leave them free, make them free, you know. And as Saizana went southwards, converting the savages in the south, or those people with no religion. So when they freed them up from backwardness, from savageness, they started calling them the free people. Free people. So free in Tigrinya means what? Hara, right?
Mhm.
So the free people means Amhara. That's where the Amhara name came. So the people in the empire of Aksum, the citizens of Aksum, were called Tahaggarai. Hagar. Hagar means civilization actually, but like a state. So who were members of that state, citizens of that states were the Tigrayans, and the freed people were called Amhara. And becoming Amhara and becoming Ethiopian became synonymous because as Saizana was converting them into Ethiopianism or to be Ethiopian, at the same time he was converting them to be Christian and making them Amhara or free people. So that's how the story came. So this was one of the peak times for the Aksumite civilization. And after about 400 years, then King Caleb came. So until Caleb, the Aksumite Empire expanded all the way to Arabia, as I mentioned to you earlier. So during the time of Caleb, the Yemeni Arabians were not willing to pay their tributes. So King Caleb sent his general named Abraha. So Abraha went to Yemen and defeated the Arabs and stayed there. So one thing interesting that happened, again, this tells you most people do not understand what happened after Aksum civilization. How did we end up in this situation? This will explain to you what happened. So the Aksumite Empire strength depended on the trade route at the Red Sea. So controlling both sides of the Red Sea was a critical component of the strength of Aksum. So Abraham controlled the eastern side, which is the Arab side of the Red Sea. What happened was at that time there was a place called Kaaba, which is in Mecca. Kaaba still exists today in Saudi Arabia, and Kaaba. This is before Islam came, by the way, before the Prophet Muhammad came. So the Arabs had a long history of doing a pilgrimage to Kaaba because they believe this is where Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. And God came and gave him the sheep instead of Isaac, right? So if you know that story.
Yeah.
So that's where they believe it happened. So they do pilgrimage to Kaaba. So Abraham, which is the Aksumite king's general who was ruling in Arabia then, said he built a great church, St. Mary's Church in Sana'a, today's Yemen's capital, in Sana'a, and he said from now on, no Arab goes to Kaaba. You should come to this church. All right. So, and the Arabs, this was very difficult for them. It's like telling Tigrayans do not go to Aksum, right? So it was not acceptable for them. So they revolted. So he led an army of elephants that were brought from India and from Tigray and from Aksum Empire. So he led that army to defeat the Mecca people or the people of Kaaba. So this is, by the way, you can. I encourage all the youth who are following this to go into YouTube and Google for Abraha and his elephants. This is a story that every single Arab learns as they grow up. So when Abraha reached to Mecca, as you know, Arabia is a desert place. His army was stricken by a disease, and majority of his soldiers died. Well, the Arab side of the story is different. The Arab side of the story is, God was angry because he was trying to destroy Kaaba. So God sent birds with fire called Ababil is the bird's name. You can Google that, by the way, or you can find it in YouTube. You'll find a lot of interesting stories about those. So the Ababil threw stones with fire and destroyed his army. That's what the Arab side of story is. But the realistic scientific story is his army died. What majority of his army died due to the disease that they caught in their journey. So I'll tell you one thing here. So if you see most of the prophet's history, Prophet Muhammad's history, you see that majority of his followers and even his babysitter, his own, when he grew up, and the person who said Azan for the first time, Bilal, all those people are Habesha people. Most people don't know how they ended up being Habesha. This is where the story comes. Uh, Abraha's soldiers, when most of them died, the remaining people were defeated by the Arabs who were waiting them in Mecca. So whoever, and the leader of those, the Mecca people, was named Abu Talib. Abu Talib was Prophet Muhammad's uncle. And Prophet Muhammad grew up in Abu Talib's house because his father and mother died when he was young. So that's why Prophet Muhammad grew up with Habesha people mostly. That's where he got most of his knowledge. These Habesha people who went with Abraha were the rank and file of the great General Abraha, who had a lot of knowledge. But eventually, because they died, majority of them died because of disease, they became slaves in Mecca. And majority of Prophet Muhammad's companions, including his what he calls his mom, were Habesha, including Bilal, the first person who said, and they say 60% of his followers were Habesha too. When he was in Medina, majority of his followers and his constituency were Habesha. So after Abraha lost the war, what happened was the Aksumite Empire lost the eastern side of the Red Sea, which made it not control the Red Sea. And after that, with the expansion of Islam, the Arabs got stronger, and the caliphs, after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, the caliphs forgot the promise from the Prophet and attacked Aksum, and they destroyed it. So that's how the Aksum Empire failed, and went. Some of the people went south. Sorry, I made it longer, but I thought this is something most people do not know, so I thought I should share.
No, that was great information. Thank you for sharing, honestly. Wow. I mean, it should, that's only a small glimpse into the remarkable, rich history of just the Aksumine Empire, let alone, you know, everything that and all of the topics that are covered in your book and in our history as a whole. It's just amazing to hear something like some of these stories and excerpts of what's happened. Um, it's just unbelievable almost that an empire that was this large, this powerful, ran basically controlled the Red Sea for a long period of time is not really, similar to what we said with the Yared of Aksum, unfortunately, is not really recognized as, essentially one of the four biggest empires in world history. Um, but it's that's the point of us having, I think, this kind of conversation and bringing to light, someone who has a book, like I stated earlier, Habesha Chronicles, Ato Kidane has written and gathered a lot of important information here that can, influence the youth in terms of learning your history, but really, like you stated, kind of gives you a glimpse of where we're at, how we've gotten to where we are right now, and kind of like how we can move forward as well. So
Just
I
one
guess we
thing
could move a
to add.
little. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
One thing to add here. Most of the Western world, there is something they call the Arabic wealth of knowledge, from which they draw majority of their philosophical teachings and things like that. Well, in fact, that knowledge is the Habesha knowledge, the Aksumite knowledge, which was transferred to the Arabs. One, because they were citizens of the Aksum Empire for a long time, for about actually 900 years. Majority of Arabia was part of Aksum Empire, and that's where they draw their math, which is a great, their astronomy, and their literature. So we contributed majority of, if you see the alphabets of the Latin alphabets, which English uses, are drawn. I'll tell you their root is Giz alphabet. Um, if you see the Giz alphabets, they are related to the natural way of putting out the voice. For example, if you see ha, you open your mouth. Ha, that's the opening. Ha is also is the opening of the mouth. So it just tells you how humanity started creating the symbols. It's the basic. Is by itself means base or standard. So there's a lot of knowledge hidden in our ancestors' history.
Wow, great. So I think we can move a little bit more forward in time. We can. I think it would be great. Someone I've read a lot about. Someone I am truly like intrigued about and honestly proud of as a Tagaro, as a Tagarawai, and as Tagaro as a whole. I think we should be. At Johannes, Emperor Johannes, as you stated the title, the man who gave his life to Ethiopia. So if you could just talk a little bit about his history and his impact.
Sure. Sure, definitely. So most probably this is a time where people at your age and most of the new generation would be confused about Ethiopian and Tigrayan identity. It's a very challenging time because being an Ethiopian is what most Tigrayans, including myself, have been cherishing for a long time. Have been trying to build an identity on for a long time. And one of the embodiment of this effort is Emperor Johannes. So Tigrayans in general, we did our best to build Ethiopia. Ethiopia is an empire that's a continuation of the Aksumite Empire, as I explained earlier. Ethiopians did whatever we could to build Ethiopia. And if you really look at it, whatever Ethiopia has a history, whatever Ethiopia has as a history or as even modern history, majority of it, the Tigrayans built it. So its historical heritage comes, 95% of it comes from Tigray.
Yes.
Even if we see what we call modern Ethiopia, there are three emperors who built modern Ethiopia. That's Emperor Johannes, Emperor Theodorus, and Emperor Menelik. So Emperor Johannes was, the beginner. Emperor Theodorus, Emperor Johannes, and Emperor Menelik. So Emperor Theodorus started, but the person who stabilized it and ruled it for about 25 years, actually about 20 years, is Emperor Johannes. And then Emperor Menelik followed. Even during Emperor Menelik's time, the person who contributed a lot to bring Ethiopia to the modern state administration is called Nagadras Gebrehiwot Bakadai, who is from Adwa, Tigrayan. And even during Haile Selassie's time, the things that we are proud of today, like bringing the Organization for African Union, or AU, we call it AU today, African Union, and the person who built the Ethiopian Airlines, the person who built the Bole Road, the person who built those the larger towns like Awasa, Bahar Dar, Nazareth, and Magala. This is Mangasha Siyum, Ras Mangasha Siyum. He's behind all of this, bringing African Union, building the Ethiopian Airlines, and things like that. So what I'm trying to say is Tigrayans did a lot of work to build Ethiopia. And the embodiment of that is Emperor Johannes. The vision Emperor Johannes had for Ethiopia and what was built later as Ethiopia are not the same, though. That's where the big difference comes. The Ethiopia that Emperor Johannes envisioned was the Ethiopia where all of its people live being proud of who they are. When Emperor Johannes defeated a king, he never took their land. He never tried to convert their identity. He always held the belief that people should stay as who they are, but become citizens of Ethiopia. So this federalist system that we tried to build after a long time It was not started by the second Wayane or TPLF. It was started even during Emperor Johannes' time, or even before that. Tigray had its own king, Shawa had its own king, Oromo had their own king. So um, he believed that emanates from the deep meaning we have for humanity in our hearts. That's when I say we, I mean Tigrayans. We have a strong sense of respect for humanity. We have a strong sense of respect for human identity. And we always held that. That's why the Prophet Muhammad said to his followers, go to those people, the Habesha people. They know justice. They respect people as humanity. And that's true. That's who we are. That's who Tigrayans are until today. That's who we are. Um, so that's the strong psychological makeup of the Tigrayan society. Obviously, that's not getting along with the other psychological makeups that's building Ethiopia today. So that's where the big conflict of identity that, as I explained earlier. And we should not be ashamed of that or anything. It's obvious we have to face it. There is a conflict of identity about being an Ethiopian versus a Tigrayan, right? We have to face it and resolve it. Uh, so, as I said earlier, this conflict comes because, one, as Tigrayans, we have a strong, deep rooted sense of respect for humanity. But today's Ethiopia is not built based on that. That's where the conflict comes. So we have to resolve it. How do we resolve it? Get back to our roots, build our own nation with our true sense of identity. I think that's where the solution lies. And I'm sure Emperor Johannes would be proud to see us build that nation.
I agree. That's a great point, and exactly why, as we said earlier, each of us, in terms of how the history of our people and Tigray really relates to today, and kind of how you can use it as perspective of where we are, and not to repeat, but really how we can move forward and to prosper and to prevent these kind of things from that our people are facing currently. Um, so I think a great person, and the person I'm actually named after would be great to discuss currently. Just because we've talked about Ats Johannes, Ras Allah Abanaga, a one of the, I would say, the greatest general in the history of Africa, if not, if you want to expand further out from there, you can certainly make that, and the history itself defends that claim. If you could just give a little bit in terms of relating to what you brought up with Atsianis in terms of what he did for Ethiopia, if you could just talk about and give perspective of his accomplishments and really what he means to the history of Tigray and um, the history of Habesha people.
Uh, so, to your point, Alula is the greatest general in Africa. There's no question about that ever, because his wisdom, his strategy is unmatchable until today. Uh, well, in Ethiopia, the Adwa victory is celebrated a lot. There is a reason for that. Uh, Alula had defeated Europeans many times before that. So Adwa is not the first time when an African defeats Europeans. So if you hear other people say that, tell them it's not true. Actually, I'll tell you, there's a bigger battle called Dogali. In Dogali, which is in Eritrea today, which was Alula's administration zone, the zone that he administered, called Hamasen then at that time. So when Italians came to colonize the Habesha people, Alula defeated them in Dogali. Today, if you go to Rome, there is a square called Piazza de Cinquecento, which means the 500 square. That's where Alula killed 500 of their rank and file military officers. This doesn't include the what are called the Askaris, the soldiers of Habesha origin or things like that, or the Libyans. This is just the Italian rank and file soldiers, not soldiers, but officers. Uh, so the battle that the Italians built uh, memorial square for is Dog Ali, as a matter of fact. That's where they are defeated the most, in the most hurting way. So if there is a true reason to celebrate, it will be that one. Uh, the Adwa victory is also a great victory, which was led by himself, Alula, and a spy known as Bashai Awalo. Actually, the role Bashai Awalo, the spy, the James Bond of the time, the role he played was very critical for the victory. If it was not for Bashar al-Alam, the Habesha would not have won that war. And Bashar al-Alam was Alula's spy. And Alula strategized from the get-go, making sure they trust Bashar al-Alam. He trained him and he sent him. And then he gave them a wrong information so that they get into the circle under which Alula's soldiers could attack them. Uh, well, Alula wanted to free the zone that he used to administer, which is Hamassen in Eritrea. But he asked Emperor Minilik to send him horsemen, the Oromo horsemen. But Minilik was not willing to do that. Because of that, the Tigrayans of northern Merab and the southern Merab remain divided until today as Eritreans and Tigrayans. Now I'm giving you where that division started. So since then, the Minilik agreed with Italy to divide the Tigrayans into two, where those Tigrayans who lived in north of Merab were called Eritrea by the Italians, and those of us who lived southern of Merab remained Tigrayans. Or Ethiopians as citizenship. Both of them are Tigrayans, regardless. So Alula was really devastated about that because that was the area he set up Asmara. He's the one who founded Asmara. So it must have been very painful for him to see his people under the Italian occupation. But eventually he had a strong sense of Ethiopian identity, so he fought for Ethiopia in Adwa too. He was hoping he would reclaim his people back, but Minilik conspired with the Italians and handed the people north of the Marab River to the Italians. So the people in the central, the people who follow Minilik, celebrate Adwa, I think, for that reason, because they were able to defeat their Tigrayan counterparts by dividing them into two. Otherwise, if there is to celebrate, the Dogali victory would have been a bigger one to celebrate with.
I certainly agree. Dogali was an absolute massacre for Italians and embarrassing for them in terms of like the world perspective. That they didn't want, especially if during that time, no one would want to admit that an African country, independent sovereign country, was able to defeat their troops in that manner. And it certainly stands out to me as well as the most crucial battle, as you stated. Something also I wanted to touch on Allah was your perspective. How do you feel? Because Allah was from Tembian, a very, very, just essentially had a side farmer, like very poor family and background. He did not come from, king's family or prince or related in any way to higher standing family. And I think Tigray during that time, especially, was based off of family almost wealth in terms of not just money, but in terms of you are the son of or the cousin of a kala. So it gives you a lot of standing in the country. Do you think if he was not the son of a peasant or son of a of a farmer, he would be able to had obviously he had massive in terms of you know strategical and war and being a general success and defeated many opponents and defended his country. But do you think he would have been able to help Tigray a little bit more if he was not, kind of cast off by most of the higher up society of Tigray at the time?
Well, I would rather say the challenge that he had to go through to get to where he was made him a lot stronger. You're
Okay.
right. It's a stratified society where there were the royal family, then the rank and file, which were called Masafint and Makwanant, and also the Harastai people or the farmers. Um, but one thing I will tell you, again, this tells a lot about the Tigrayan society. Now, if you go to Shawa or Gojam or somewhere, the Masafint or the princess uh, had a lot of wealth compared to the farmers. In Tigray, that was not the case. So down south, there was a system called Gult, which is the farmer that lives on the land. The land is not his; it's the Masfin's or the prince's land, and the farmer had to pay one third to the church, one third to the prince, and one third to himself, or something like that. Uh, so in Tigray, that was not the case completely. In Tigray, every farmer had his or her own land, including the women, by the way. It's the system is called Risti. In the Rist system, everybody had land. So the princes and the rank and file, Makwanant, well, they were better than the farmers, but it's not like uh, a system where the farmers were really underprivileged. Actually, when there's surplus of products and things like that, the farmers were richer than sometimes the the princes in some situations. No prince can take a farmer's land. No, so it's deep in the society's culture. So sometimes I'm opposed to this idea of land to the tiller, which is a great thing in the south. In the north, in Tigray, land to the tiller always had land. That was not a problem at all. So I want to make a very good point because that speaks a lot about the society's psychological makeup. It's not, uh, you know, uh, mistreating people is not in our DNA, in our social DNA. That's the point I'm trying to make. But overall, the fact that Alula came from a farmer family, I think it made him as strong as he was, because he had to pass through that social ego and struggle. The difference between classes and things like that. So I think it made him stronger. And the lessons we should draw from that is no matter who we are or where we are, we can be whatever we want to be, right? So as long as we have the determination, and that's why Alula became strong. And Tigrayans are typically, that's our history. We always pass through hardships, and eventually we come victorious. Uh, Today too, we will come victorious, and hopefully we have a special attachment to gold. There is a reason for that. Gold comes the way you draw gold from the earth. It goes through a lot of fire, a lot of fire. So maybe that special attachment to gold comes from our history of going through a lot of fires, I believe.
Wow, that's a great perspective to kind of think about this right there in terms of gold. I never actually heard it, stated that way. But I think would we so during the time you touched on it already a little bit, but during that time is the rise of Emperor Menelik, right? The second. So Menelik, I think you described him in your book as the man or the king, Nugus, who merged north and south, right? And I think he's in Ethiopia. I think he is, to say the least, kind of a person where his history and his impact is not really unified in terms of everybody's perspective of what he actually is. To be blamed for what he actually did or didn't do. One thing, for example, the treaty that you mentioned earlier with the Italians, in terms of what did he sign and what didn't he sign, and what did he give and what didn't he give in terms of what is known as Eritrea now. Um, if you could just expand a little bit more than what we talked about on him in terms of how he frames the turn into today's climate in terms of today's Ethiopia and Tigray.
Um, so I think this the perspective on Menelik comes from two directions. One is if you live in Shawa in the central Ethiopia, and if you are of an Amhara origin, Menelik is a hero. Um, if you are a Tigrayan and you live in Tigray, he definitely caused Tigray a lot of pain and problem. If you are an Oromo, the same thing. He caused a lot of pain to the Oromo. So it's from where you look at it. And even in the politics, there are two ways of looking at Ethiopia. I was trying to explain that there are two perspectives. As a Tigrayan, we want to keep our identities of this Tigray heritage. If you are one of those who are proud of your identity and want to keep that heritage, Minilik is the villain, right? He's your enemy. If you are one who is willing to leave your identity and become the new Ethiopian identity, which is built on the Amhara culture, is going to be your hero. That's where the divide is today. And most of us Tigrayans and most of the Oromo people and the Walaita are not willing to do that. That's where the big divide comes from. Typically, Tigrayans, we do not believe in vengeance, and we're not vengeful. Because of that, we don't bring Menelik's name a lot. But the damage he caused to Tigray is not even measurable. It's after the Adwa war, Menelik's soldiers did the same thing that today's Abiy's soldiers are doing in Tigray. Actually, at Menelik's time, they say 2/3 of the Tigray society was annihilated or died of different reasons, hunger, some of them killed by Menelik soldiers, and a whole lot of problems. 2/3. So he caused a lot of damage in Tigray. But again, as we should be, we're not vengeful. We do not look things from just from the past. We want to always look forward and be hopeful. That's our nature, Tigrayans. And I think that should be the case. We should continue to do that. But this time, I think we should build our own nation where we can be proud of and where we can direct it to the direction that we want and we aspire. If we do that, I think majority of those problems, those conflicts, would be minimized. I think you are on mute.
Can you hear me now?
You are on mute now.
I think you should be able to hear me. Sorry for the technical difficulties. But yeah, no, it's a great point. What you stated is just very only a small glimpse in terms of what we have, endured. But as you stated, really the most important is not to dwell. It's more to learn from our history and to continue to try to prevail and move forward through difficult times as we have faced right now. I think it would be great if we could. You touched on him a little bit earlier. If you could just talk a little bit more on the last, I guess, king, if you want. I think you've stated that as such in your book, but Haile Selassie, obviously, he has a major role in terms of before Dergi Gized, before Mendes and everything that's come after him. He has a major role in terms of how we proceeded into today's Tigray. So I was curious if you could just elaborate a little bit for the youth in terms of what his history kind of was.
Yep. Yeah. So Haile Selassie is another interesting person, right? As I explained earlier, it's the perspective that you have that determines how you feel about that emperor. If you are in Shawa and you aspire that Amhara identity based Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie is also a hero for those people in that setting. But if you are a Tigrayan who is proud of your cultural and historical heritage, Haile Selassie did no less bad things than Menelik, but in a different way. Haile Selassie was more diplomatic in his approach, and he had a longer time to do whatever he wanted to do. But overall, what he did is continued to build what Menelik started. He continued to build Ethiopia based on the Amhara image, and tried to actually what Menelik envisioned was completely done by Haile Selassie. Even at Menelik's time, Wollo had its own king. Tigray, even if it didn't have a king, but had its own administration. And the others were the same way. One of the key problems we have today, where the southern Tigray, they claim to be Amhara, which is the Raya. It's Haile Selassie who gave it to his son-in-law, I believe, at that time, as part of Wollo. Now, even if it was Wollo, Wollo is not an Amhara region, though. In Wollo, there is Oromo, there is Amhara, there is Tigrayan, there is Agaw. But again, he took it from Tigray. The same happened on the western Tigray. Menelik started it, but Haile Selassie was the one who put it into paper that western Tigray will be part of Gondar. Again, Gondar is not Amhara. Gondar is not equal to Amhara. Actually, Amhara is a minority in Gondar. There are more, well, at that time, there were more Tigrayans in Gondar than Amhara. In Gondar, there were Tigrayans, there were Kamand, there were the Falasha, there were other ethnic groups too. Amhara were minority. So today, that's their claim. They claim that it was part of Gondar, so it's Amhara. Well, who said Gondar is Amhara? First of all, Gondar was not Amhara. Wollo was not Amhara. In Wollo, again, Amhara was a minority. Majority of Wollo at that time was Afar. And then there is the Oromo. Then there is the Agaw. Then Amhara comes. So anyways, Haile Selassie purposefully combined this and created this, what they call Kiflahagars, or regions, to convert the Afar, the Agaw, the Tigray into Amhara, that Amhara identity. So the way he did it was very systematic, but he continued Menelik's legacy. So that's why he is idolized in Shawa. Now, I think he had his strengths. He was a very strong diplomatic diplomat. He was renowned in the world, and I appreciate those strengths of his. And we should measure everybody with objectivity, right, as it comes to strengths and weaknesses. He was a very strong leader, but as a Tigrayan, he tried to destroy the Tigray identity. So from that aspect, I think he was the villain for us. But as a diplomat, he was one of the great emperors of the world. There's no question about that.
Yes, and I think like all of the people we discussed today, something that you said at the end there is very important in terms of you can always discuss the positives of especially somebody who is serving office or is a king or is running the country essentially. You can discuss the positives and the negatives of someone without glorifying or objectifying them in such a manner, almost as like a holy status. We can discuss he did right here and he did wrong here, and he really tried to affect and almost diminish, the Tigrayan identity. So that was another great point. Thank you. And as we stated before, there's so many more people in the history of Tigray, history of Habesha people, Ethiopia, that we did not bring up during this discussion that you cannot fit into one talk. But again, Ato Kidane has a book out, Habesha Chronicles, where you can get some, maybe, I wouldn't put a percentage on it, but a large percentage of the historical and prominent figures in our history that I think is really helpful for the youth to get some information here and kind of understand their identity and who we are as a people. So if we could, I would like to talk a little bit on, we talked throughout this in terms of how it relates into Tigray today, but just a few specific points in terms of, how exactly, if cumulatively in terms of what we discussed, this truly has gotten us to this point. I know we did touch on it a few times, but if we could elaborate a little bit there, I would appreciate it.
How did we come to this situation?
Yes.
So earlier I talked about how the Great Aksumite Empire started, and then the decline started with the defeat of Abraha, Emperor Caleb's general in Kaaba or in Mecca. After his defeat, Aksum lost the eastern side of the Red Sea. So that made it lose its control over the trade route in the Red Sea. So that was a big blow to the economy of Aksum. And then after that, with the expansion of Islam, during the Prophet Muhammad's time, the Aksumite king had a very good relationship with the Prophet. But after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, then the successor caliphs were expanding their territory. And as part of that, they controlled all northern Africa. That included Egypt, Libya, Morocco, above the Sahara. And also they expanded westwards to the Aksumite Empire. And as you know, the Aksumite Empire were their previous administrators. So very similar to what's happening today. Once they defeated, they mercilessly persecuted all the leaders of the Aksum. The church artifacts survived, some of them, because they fled south and were hidden in the Tana Lake, in the Zuwai Lake in the south, and in the highlands of what we call Wallo today, around Lalibela, and in the highlands of Tigray, like Garalta and places like that. But majority of the secular literature, music, wealth, all that was destroyed. So that's where we lost connection with our ancient Aksum. So the only thing that survived is the church artifacts, not the secular artifacts. That's something I really, really regret, because when we think of our heritage, the only thing we find is the church side of it. But there is a lot of wisdom, wealth, knowledge in the secular side, in engineering, in science, in math, astronomy. There was a lot of knowledge and artifacts, literature, and all that. But that was destroyed at that time. Actually, at the time of another great queen known as Yodit Gudit. Well, Gudit is not her name, but Yodit. Her, and then after that, the caliphs came and destroyed Aksum, especially majority of the northern Marab area, the lowlands, which is now Eritrea, and the eastern side, which is now Afar, was destroyed, and the caliphs controlled it. So what remained of Aksum was just the highlands in the west of Aksum, which is like areas around Tamben, and south in the areas of Agao, today Wallo, Lalibela, Lasta, Sokota, those areas. That's where our ancestors fled, and that's where they hid. And some of them fled south to Shawa. So after that, the Aksumite empire was destroyed. Whatever remained of Aksum went south in, as I mentioned, in Lasta, Sokota area with the Agao, and formed what's called the Zagwe regime. So the Zagwes are the ones who built the Lalibela rock-hewn church. Again, they were, even though as not great as the Aksumite kings, but they were great kings because they learned things from the Aksumites. And the teachings of Yared continued through that time. After the Zagwe, that's when the Shawa kings came and formed the new Ethiopia. Now that's where the Ethiopia link breaks with the Aksum Empire. The new Ethiopia was formed in Shawa by a king known as Yukunno Amlak of Shawa. So after that, Amharic became the language, and after that, the northern part, which is mainly Tigray, was economically not in par with its ancestors. Since then, for about 800 years, we are still suffering. So I think this is time the new generation will say, we have to find our roots, we have to go back to our heritage and build Tigray to where it belongs to.
Yes, absolutely. I think that last line there, when you're saying, we have to find our roots, understand our history, and really rebuild means more than just the physical aspect. It's the psychological, cultural, all the aspects that come with that as well of being Tagaru. So I think this was a lot of great discussion here where we talked about a lot of our history, and I certainly appreciate the perspective you give here. And your book I read leading up to this discussion was more than informative, to be honest. It was fascinating in terms of just the perspectives of throughout history, how each time you see the old saying is true. History does, in fact, repeat itself. It may be slightly different or in a different view, but it certainly repeats itself in Tigray, let alone the whole world. So is there one fundamental message, you did touch on it on that last line, that you'd like to share to the youth in terms of learning their history, or in terms of how they can shape Tigray going forward through that specifically?
Sure, definitely. I mentioned a little bit of statistics about the Jew community in the US and Europe. And if you see the history of Israel, Israel is just, it was formed in 48, so it's just about 60 years old. And see how great a nation it is today. It's, as I mentioned earlier, it's after Silicon Valley, Tel Aviv is where most of technological innovations are happening today. So what do we learn from that, especially the new generation? If you see, go back and see the history of Israel. Who built Israel? It's the new generation. The new generation, they went back, took their knowledge, expertise, and built their nation. And we have a lot of similarities. They are about 6 million. We are now about 9 million. I think we are about 9 million too. They have a long history of statehood, a lot of literature and a lot of history. The same, Tigrayans, we have a lot of history and heritage. So we have a lot of similarities. They are surrounded by enemies. We are in the same situation. That should make us strong, just like Yared, just like Alula. Having those challenges should make us strong. Tigray's future depends on this new generation, our determination to go back and build it. That's where its future depends. If we are determined, we can do it. Our ancestors have done it. They were one of the 4 great civilizations in the world, along with China, Roma, and Persia. So I call this new generation to be determined and build the new nation of Tigray. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. Thank you so much again for your time. It was more than you can ask in terms of information from your book. Habesha Chronicles, I think, is certainly a compilation, but is still, I think, important for a lot of the youth to get a perspective of themselves. Again, as I stated earlier, I just want to really thank you for your time here, and I hope that everybody can share and post this with, specifically Tagaro youth all over the world, but also to anyone who is really trying to learn more of where we come from, understand more perspectives, and really just truly understand what actually occurred and who these people were, not really in terms of the propaganda and trying to blame and shift or assign who's responsible for what throughout the history of time. Because as we stated, unfortunately, history does repeat itself. So as Kidane said, let's be determined to create a new future for Tigray. And doing so requires you to understand where we're coming from, who we are, and all of that that's involved with it. Again, I want to say thank you for your time. And we have this new program, English program for Axiom Media Network. We'll be doing this weekly, where we'll either discuss with somebody who has information to share, such as Atokirane here, or we'll be discussing with other fellow youth in terms of what kind of work we're trying to get started around the world in terms of various organizations, or how to affect change in terms of what's going on in Tigray right now, and stopping essentially the plight of our people. Until next week, thank you.
Thank you.